Most of the world's people today live under the rule of a state, and most of us, if we're lucky, mainly interact with the state through its rationing system. Unfortunately for us, we don't recognize what we deal with on a daily basis as a rationing system, let alone as part of the state. That's partly because the invisibility benefits the state by naturalizing the rationing system. But it's also constantly reinforced by media, schools, punditry, and intellectuals who treat corporations and NGOs as being separate from the state. In other words, to them, the state is just a synonym for the government. There are certain ideas that we need to get over to properly understand the state's rationing system. Let's address some of the most common brainworms used to disguise the state's rationing system as a natural part of being human. The first one is the barter myth, which is easily the most pervasive myth. The story is that a long time ago, we used to live in a really inefficient society based on barter. People went down to the market to swap their beef for some fish, but the guy who has fish to offer doesn't want beef. He wants pork. So you have to trade the pork guy for your beef to trade for the fish. Then one of the things people trade was chosen to become money, and the rest is history. This is ubiquitous in pop histories of money and economics and in introductory econ textbooks. This is also what Marx writes in Capital. This is what your teachers or parents would probably tell you if you asked them where money comes from. Unfortunately for this version of history, there is absolutely no evidence that it ever happened. It's just a tale created by philosophers and political economists who simply thought about what a society without money might be like, without attempting to base it on any sort of evidence. It partly relies on our biases that people from a long time ago had monkey brains and would base their whole society on doing something, even if it makes no sense at all. If you're interested in learning more about what pre-monetary societies were actually like, I would recommend Debt by David Graeber, or maybe Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott. The second myth is called the scarcity myth, and this is one that high school econ textbooks very commonly teach, and it's pure ideology. The idea is that humans have limited means and unlimited wants, something usually supported by saying, I want 50 mansions and I want 50 cars, or pointing at billionaires. Since scarcity exists, we need capitalism/markets to manage the scarce resources, and that point will be elaborated further in the next myth. For this one, if the problem is that we have limited means and unlimited wants, why does that mean we should let some people have the 50 cars and others are forced to live in squalor? Any system of managing resources that doesn't guarantee that everyone can eat, that everyone has decent shelter, that child labor or slavery doesn't happen, and that people aren't forced to work for a boss isn't a rational way to manage scarcity. So returning to the market part, so the efficient or fair market myth is a prevailing understanding among economists and their fandom. This is the myth that markets are used because they're the most efficient and or fair way to allocate resources. Now, this is an extremely in-depth discussion, so way outside the context of this video, but I'll try and give a surface-level argument. The idea that markets are efficient is essentially founded on either the idea that monetary expenses represent some physical quantity of resources, or that earning profit means you are providing some benefit to others. Both require that prices represent value, but prices, as we'll discuss later, don't represent value, they represent power differences. So expenses don't represent some physical quantity that goes into efficiency, nor do they represent some social quantity that goes into fairness. All right, so now we come to the part that I actually wanted to do this video for. What is this political economic fusion rationing system? Let's break it up into parts and talk about each. I want to keep this short so I won't cover everything, but I will cover what I think are the most important and interesting parts. So the first and most important part of the rationing system is you, dear viewer. If you are watching this, you are a captive worker of a state. You pay taxes and you probably buy stuff. In order to do either, you have to serve the state in some way, either directly or indirectly. Workers in states are organized into hierarchies, which form a command structure and a class system simultaneously. Your boss will, with few exceptions, make significantly more money than you. In fact, Blair Fix of York U has found that your position in a business or government hierarchy is by far the best predictor of outcome. Better than age, skill level, IQ, race, gender, or productivity. Although, of course, some of those will mediate your likelihood of being higher or lower in a hierarchy. Now, there isn't a single unified hierarchy in the entire world with one person on top. There are many rival ones. Some of them are extremely large, though. Two of the top five are McDonald's and Walmart, and all of the rest are the largest military powers in the world. So it's like number 1, the DoD, number 2, the People's Liberation Army, number 3, Walmart. So the front line of work in states is extraction, construction, and manufacturing. And these are usually the most brutal and slavish jobs. Today, as in the past, mining, fishing, construction, and farming are rife with slavery, child labor, violence, and are done primarily by racialized or immigrant populations. For example, the US has 2 types of lower class citizens defined in its laws, non-naturalized immigrants and criminals. And they are both paid well below what is already a harsh minimum for full citizens, and they're regularly subjected to cruel violence. On the other hand, we have the cushy office jobs, which are mostly useless to the functioning of a non-state society, but in a state, they include various types of record keeping, management, surveillance, propaganda, advisement, research, and technical jobs. Where these sort of jobs may seem necessary, particularly in the technical and research fields, they're often formalizing or centralizing work that would normally be done by non-experts. So mining, harvesting, fishing, logging, drilling, and so on produce captive resources, which are controlled through buying and selling, which we'll get to in a second. But first, we have to talk about money and currency. Money and currency are the currents that sweep people and resources along the flows of power. The power is what actually make things happen, while money and currency are a sort of computational ritual tool to direct and organize it. And for us mortals, it's just a ticket for the ration house. So while money didn't necessarily originate as a state construct, money in a stateless context is used for a very different and more spiritual purpose, which is outside the context of this video. So I know that money in a stateless context exists, but it's not important to this. We're talking only about states. In the modern context, money is the unit that prices, credits, debits, assets, and liabilities are denoted in. Examples of money are the US dollar, the euro, the yen, and so on. And this is also called money of account. Currency, on the other hand, is the realized quantity of money. The examples of that are dollar bills, euro bills, and yen bills, and coins, and so on. They are also called money of exchange or money of reckoning. So to clarify with an imperfect analogy, money is akin to a meter, while currency is akin to a meter stick. Today, credit is created freely with no pretense of being backed by anything like gold or silver. The true backing, though, is the same as it's always been. Goons, goons, goons! US dollars will buy stuff because of all the US soldiers and cops and prison guards who enforce American control of landed resources. And the value of dollars is what land, labor, and resources you can purchase with them and how cheaply. I could talk about why currencies used to be made of precious metals, but I won't because it would take a long time and it's pretty boring. So the biggest hurdle that a lot of people have in understanding money as it actually operates is an idea that's hammered into us, which is that money has a fluctuating value. And by this, I don't mean the foreign exchange rate, which is obviously something that exists, but is a specific business and a layer of complication that I'm going to avoid. I'm talking about the ideas of inflation and other macroeconomic concepts that refer to things affecting the value of the dollar or some such crap like that. Again, money is a unit, so the dollar's value is always a dollar. A $20 bill is always worth $20. Always and forever, everywhere in the US, in every situation. It never changes. The thing that does change is the monetary measure of everything else. All vehicles, for example, have gotten remarkably faster from the 18th to the 21st century, but we wouldn't say that the mile per hour has slowed. All buildings have gotten remarkably taller from the 18th to the 21st century, but we wouldn't say that the meter has shrunk. But when inflation is explained by experts or teachers, it's always that the value of money has decreased, that the value of money causes the prices to decrease. But the reality is that the prices increasing are simply analogous to the value of money decreasing. But it actually is the price that's increasing and not the value of money decreasing. Note this graphic saying how inflation has changed the price, which not only perpetuates this myth of the value of money, but even obviates the possibility that the price of coffee has changed just so the coffee company can pay itself more money. All right, so this brings us to prices, which is the thing that I mentioned that just fluctuates. The prices that you pay at the store to buy stuff are obviously prices, but there are other types as well, such as fines, fees, wages, taxes, debts, rents, and one could argue interest rates. Prices are measures in money for directing the state. You may think this is a weird way to put it. The libertarian in you may be saying, someone has a bike and I give them money for it. How is that directing the state? That's the classic libertarian surface level, no context understanding of things. In state society, the crucial aspect of purchase and sale isn't to change possession, but to change which way the state's guns point. One obvious example of this is the sale and rental of land. When you rent a house, you possess it, and you even have the right to exclude people, including your landlord, from entering. But the landlord ultimately owns the property, and it's only due to his graces that you can possess it. If you try to keep possession of it without paying rent, you will eventually wind up with armed men asking you to leave. And when you widen your definition of price, it becomes even more obvious. A fine is a price that you avoid to have guns pointed in your face for some infraction, some crime. Modern states are so pervasive today because most of the gun stuff has just been coded into ritual, hidden by omission by state media, and justified with theories of social contracts and unlimited wants. Most people who are evicted or plundered by the state will either see it as justified, feel like no one cares, or just fear the violence that would surely come if they resisted. Now, this particular part is starting to tread into the territory of criminality in the legal system, which is a much deeper level to the state that's strongly connected to rationing, but is a whole other huge topic that I'm not going to talk about here. So back to price. Economists, with few exceptions, explain price as a function of value. From Aquinas to Marx to Keynes to the invenerable Hayek, all major theories of price state that prices are an imperfect reflection of value, with the only disagreement being what that value is or how it specifically differs from the value. No one, though, disagrees that prices are some representation of value, except for fringe weirdos like me and Bichler and Nitzan. The problem with the idea of labor or subjective value being the basis of price is that neither of them have a unit or any inherent fixed relationship to money. Labor isn't a unit, and it's not a value in money. And likewise, subjective value is not, there's no unit of subjective value. Some people have theorized that there is the unit called a util, but that doesn't exist, and it's unobservable and makes no sense. So what determines the price of an hour in money? It is the bargaining power between employees and employers. This is very obvious if you think about how unionization, which solidifies worker power, increases wages, and vice versa. Prices on goods are likewise a function of bargaining power, both in terms of the cost floor that they need to exceed to be profitable, and in terms of the size of the profit margin. An easy example of this is that Apple can buy iPhones from the factory at a lower price than their competitors, as well as sell it for a higher price than their competitors, in both cases because they have higher market share and dominate the phone market. Taxation and debt is a whole other thing to get into, so I'll just say this. Taxes and debts are both tools to capture workers. States impose taxes or debts on people so that they need to work for money. This was especially important before states controlled more or less all of the world's landed resources. State money likely co-evolved with taxes, starting from pre-money, pre-taxes, just confiscation. States began to quantify the supposed obligations of things that they were confiscating that people owed them, and they did so in a common unit. So the typical unit was grain, like emmer wheat or barley or something like that. In very early states, there were lists of prices of other goods that were denoted in grain money, which people could pay their taxes and debts in rather than in the grain itself. And states probably, if I had to guess, stopped using grain money for the same reason that we stopped using money, which is supposedly backed by gold, because it seriously limits the amount of money that you can create, the level of extraction that you can carry out. States have to procure grain. They can't just create grain from paper or numbers in a computer. Some may ask how this isn't barter. It's barter for the simple fact that all resources are traded and priced in a common unit, rather than negotiating a trade each time based on the value of each resource to each person in the trade each time a trade happens, which is what barter is. All right, so taxes and debts push people into the state's forced labor system and make resources available for money. Who gets to decide who uses those resources and how? In modern states, it's mainly lenders and investors. Lenders decide who is allowed to mobilize state resources by extending credit. There are different levels of hierarchy for this. There is the central bank and the reserve banks, which are direct offshoots of the government. And there are private commercial banks, all of which loan money to mainly other banks. There are also retail banks, which hold people's money and offer personal or small business loans to individuals. Bank loans are based on collecting interest, meaning the borrower basically pays rent on the bank's money. To be clear, though, when banks lend money, they aren't lending currency. They simply write a money figure in their account sheet that represents a payment of currency that they potentially owe you. But since banks are backed by the government and no one doubts that the bank could make that payment, the money figure is treated as no different from currency. So banks aren't even charging you for currency that they earned elsewhere. They're charging you for a potential payment on your behalf that they created out of thin air by writing a number in a computer. Non-banks can also be lenders. The sharks, for example, will lend money at interest to help businesses grow more powerful, and they do that out of their own currency instead of creating it from nothing by adding a loan to a bank deposit sheet. More often, though, non-banks provide cash or credit to businesses to grow them as investment, which grants them an ownership stake in the business. So lending has been around for thousands of years, but investment as a concept is more recent. It derives from investiture, which is a pre-modern ritual that grants state power to someone by clothing them in official garments or vestments. The power that they would have gained through investiture would surely have come in the form of command over workers or goons or medium to large scale control of resources. Today's version of investiture does the same thing, but in a rationalized and quantified way. So to summarize, lenders and investors delegate the state's control over resources and workers to others on the expectation that they can collect rents on it or have an ownership stake in a growing business. One of the most recent additions to the state system is the enormous Byzantine system of finance that has repeatedly caused global economic crises. At the root of all the complexity is basically just a system for buying and selling partial ownership of corporations. So despite the perception that capitalism is all about minimizing costs and maximizing profits, capitalism is all about mergers and acquisitions. Mergers and acquisitions are by far the best predictor of a company's ability to dominate the market. At the time of recording, for example, Amazon had just bought MGM for $8.5 billion, and Discovery is attempting a $45 billion merger with Warner Media. Now we come to corporations, which are the dominant form of organization in the modern state. They're created through a combination of government fiat, which determines their high-level structure and function, capital raised from lenders and investors, and captive workers and resources to carry out the boss's direction. The modern corporation evolved out of the management of colonies in the 17th century. The various East India companies and other companies which sent voyages to Indonesia and the Caribbean, Africa, and so on, to enslave the local population and steal their resources. These companies and subsequent ones were created by royal charter until 1844, when British Parliament passed the Joint Stock Companies Act, which allowed anyone to create a corporation via a government registrar. And today, corporations are more advanced, but they're basically the same. You can look up your state or country's registrar, and you can create a corporation right now if you have the money. You can hire captive workers and pay them in the state's currency, and the state will enforce any legitimate provisions on their employment contracts. You can buy captive resources from other businesses or have your workers capture them for you. Corporations still exist for colonial management, but the colony today is everywhere in the world. To conclude, usually when we hear about the state, it's just some white guy, a different white guy, talking about how taxes and seatbelt laws are literally slavery. Well, in one sense, he's right. Seatbelt laws are definitely slavery, but in a different, more real sense, he's wrong. Taxes themselves aren't slavery, but they do push people into slavery. And the vast majority of interactions we have with the state are not through taxes, the IRS, and so on, but through corporations, banks, and employment. This is just a brief overview, but I hope it helps explain things. If you want to learn more, you can check out the description for some reading recommendations. I will also put the script in there if you want to share this video in written form. You can also listen to Neighbor Science, my long-running podcast, for many hours of content that go much further in depth than this, including episodes on the East India Company and a discussion on why pre-modern coins were made of precious metals. Be sure to click like and subscribe. Our podcast episodes are released automatically on YouTube, so you can listen to them here, or you can find them on any app you'd find podcasts.
Safety requirements